Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new week of Blumira Briefings, your weekly download of the top headlines relevant to your security practice with some additional context. My name is Zoe Lindsay. I'm a security strategist here at Blumira, and this week I am joined by Michael.
Hi, everybody. Michael Kellar here, VP of Product at Blumira.
Justin.
Hi there. I'm Justin Kikani, and I am an incident detection engineer here at Blumira.
And joining us for the first time of the program this week, Chris.
Hi, thanks. Chris Furner. I am the head of partner enablement.
Excellent. So as usual, we're going to start this week off by looking at some of the critical update stories from the week that have some information that may be relevant to your environment that you may want to install a patch or a more recent update. We're going to switch it up this week because our top trends have been so similar week to week, and we don't want to sort of reiterate the same advice. We're introducing this week, our trends are going to look at the most rare trends and talk about some of those less often seen, but in some cases, more severe findings that we're having pop up. Then we've got a few general update stories and a good breakdown on scattered spider and similar help desk focused attack strains. Kicking us off, I feel like it's a little bit of Groundhog Day because we just talked about critical flaws in Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine last week. But there was an announcement of another emergency patch released on Monday. Chrome released version 137 to address 3 vulnerabilities, including CVE 2025-5419, which is a 8.8 CVSS vulnerability and is another out-of-bounds write issue in the JavaScript engine. Google's advisory on this update said that they are aware that the out-of-bounds write is being exploited in the wild. And they patched another 8.8 vulnerability. This one is 2025-5068, and that is a use after free in Blink. Justin, I think you can kick us off. What is a use after free vulnerability for folks that may not be familiar? And you know, we've talked a little bit abstractly about what goes into a CVSS rating, but these are sort of in that critical range. So what makes those more critical?
Yeah, so I'll at least speak to this case, and I want to preface that I'm not a developer. So my limited understanding of this type of vulnerability is that basically there is a reference to a memory or a part of memory that has been recently freed up. And in this particular case, what that's allowing is it's allowing for arbitrary code execution. So that means somebody can make any sort of code to then run in that reference memory or that freed up reference to memory. And that's why I think this one got the critical is arbitrary code execution, whether it's remote code execution or whether it's local code execution. Either way, seems bad.
Got that RCE, you know me. Excellent. Anybody else have thoughts they want to add? I mean, the bad news is I think this is the 3rd week out of the last month that we've seen critical Chrome updates. The better news is Chrome is generally pretty on top of pushing out those updates and addressing them promptly. So as long as you are making sure to periodically check your about and see if you need to do a relaunch and advising your users to do the same, you should be pretty well taken care of. Just something to be aware of.
Yeah, I feel like I was going to jump in. I think the biggest thing here that it reminds me of is just the fact that every couple weeks there's some update that people may or may not be aware of, and it's how hard is the job of the IT security leader at pretty much every organization, because you're responsible for getting people to update a thing that you probably don't need to know they need to update. I mean, most people are not going to know about, especially if it's every week, this week's critical Chrome update. Chrome doesn't even auto tell you that you need to worry about it most of the time. They will tell you in a month when you haven't closed Chrome, because you don't necessarily need to close Chrome or shut off your laptop. So it's just another reminder of how hard that job is, but also how important.
Yeah, and again, managing, in an enterprise environment, managing, application versions, managing updates at the centralized level helps a lot with that. At Blumira, we do that. Like, we have centralized management of our updates, and also, if you're in high risk environments, using things like Duo to not let people log in from severely out of date applications, pushing that kind of stuff too. Sometimes you have to use both, your informative tools as well as your enforcement tools to get those updates, taken care of.
Yeah,
Great
and just to piggyback on that as well, for MSP customers out there and MSP listeners out there, this is just another great case, especially if you're managing Windows environments, to force those restarts periodically, as that will always force, or at least for Windows machines, will force you to reopen Chrome, which will trigger that auto update procedure as well. And then, not to harp on it too, but having good device policies in place or tools that can manage that for you will make your life a lot easier and make that sort of something that you have to worry about one thing less.
There was a CISA alert that was released this week, adding a ConnectWise ScreenConnect bug and 4 other CVEs affecting ASUS routers and Craft CMS to the known exploited vulnerability list. Last week, ConnectWise published an advisory notifying that a very targeted nation-state attack had affected a very small number of customers, and that the affected customers were already informed. Some CEW customers have said that this CVE in the CISA alert 2025-3935 may be the vulnerability that was exploited in that incident, but that has not yet been confirmed by ConnectWise. There is a series of 5 CVEs mentioned. We will link to the advisory and to those CVEs. Aside from that ConnectWise one, there is a auth bypass on a couple of ASUS and Lyra routers, an OS command injection on another ASUS router, and then a code injection and assumed immutable file change on Craft CMS. In terms of mitigation, make sure to update ConnectWise, apply patches for those routers. Full details are in that advisory. I noticed that this advisory comes out but a couple of weeks after an FBI advisory notifying that several lines, end-of-life Linksys and Cisco routers were under attack and being used as proxies in a bot network. This just kind of makes me think, we talk a lot about shadow IT and users that kind of try and implement unapproved solutions to work around processes, but as we've seen this shift to a lot more remote work, there's sort of been this question of adopted or inherited IT, where you are now having your users transmitting data and working on networks that you may not have control over or even visibility into, whether they're working from a coffee shop or working from their home network. They may not be as up to date on patching. So how can teams, IT and security teams, help plan a defense to mitigate those kinds of risks?
I mean, going back to the basics of a lot of compliance standards, is you need to know your assets. Like in many cases with some of these, you're talking about end-of-life devices.
Yeah.
If you don't know that you have end-of-life devices out there because you don't have, asset inventories, that's problem one right there, is knowing your risks and knowing what assets are out there. So that's kind of a big thing that I think that sounds so easy that a lot of organizations are like, oh, well, that's fine. We have a spreadsheet or whatever, but it doesn't get updated. They don't use the right tools. It just sounds so basic. People think that they don't actually need to do it, but it really is a basic thing that you have to do. You can't secure what you don't know exists.
I think that this is like a good example of where you can improve the organization's security and provide a benefit or get kind of a positive interaction with your teammates, whether that is publishing an advisory out to your teams to let them know, hey, if you have one of these routers at home in your home network, you should be aware they're under threat. Kind of the next step beyond that, do a survey, find out what equipment folks have at home, and do a equipment grant, offer to send them an up-to-date piece of equipment. Nobody gets mad about getting free stuff. And you may be able to actually help them with like performance on their network as well. But you're going to know that you're going to have something that's going to be getting supported for some time, getting some updates, potentially that you could even push updates to. So I think that's another kind of opportunity there.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that too, this is something that I had to deal with when we were going through COVID. We were a 30-person company and moved everyone to remote work. The survey was a fantastic idea that I wish I would have done in the past, because it's a lot easier if you can get everyone involved rather than trying to chase your tail. And then I would also just caution that, VPNs are great, and that's certainly one strategy that you can take here. But given the nature of these vulnerabilities, that may not fully mitigate everything, but at least that does get you pointed in the right direction, I think.
And then, Chris, in my discussion points notes, I just put a placeholder that said, hold some time for Chris to talk about ConnectWise, because I know that you've got some feelings about this.
Yeah. So this comes, you had kind of talked about, indicated this a little bit. There's a lot of like unknowns about what's gone on here. They said they notified impacted organizations. It was a small number of organizations. There's potentially there seems like a lot of unknowns here, and it's really weird that we haven't heard more. Luckily, this was pretty contained. This was only their cloud-hosted environment. A lot of managed service providers use ConnectWise ScreenConnect, but they self-host it. ScreenConnect is probably the most popular remote support tool in the MSP industry. ConnectWise is, of course, the major player in the MSP community. This kind of the timing isn't really bad, but kind of bad, because they did have a vulnerability about a year ago, probably about 13 months ago. They had another vulnerability of ScreenConnect. That one was pretty severe because that impacted both hosted and on-premise environments. So that was pretty severe. So yeah, it's kind of weird that we haven't heard more at this point. This has been well over a week, I think, since this was announced, and there's still a lot of unknowns. The fact this is a targeted nation state attack is concerning, because somebody was after something very specific, and we don't know what it was yet. So I'm interested to hear more. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't hear any more about this besides just rumors and stuff, because likely whoever was targeted by this doesn't want anybody to know.
Which is just a complicating factor, because we've talked on previous episodes of Briefings a lot about, you can't necessarily get a fair assessment of whether a organization, you should have more or less trust in them after they've had an incident. Even the best secured environments potentially could experience an incident. What you can get some visibility from and some good intel from is how they respond to that incident, how transparent and prompt they are in disclosing, how clear they are on mitigation and what can be done. Something that I think Jake brought up in a previous episode is he loves to see when folks both notify of a patched update, but also possible workarounds, because there are situations where it may not be viable to take that system offline, or it may not be compatible to do that update. So I think that, definitely going to watch and see here. It is a complicating factor when it's affecting, basically potentially a recognizably small number of customers, where it's hard to talk about without potentially sharing some of those details. But definitely will be curious to see what we continue to hear or don't from that.
Yeah. My understanding of this attack was that the target was the ability to do remote code execution on endpoints. And that's, of course, super concerning. That goes back to, you see a lot of software vendors saying, oh, well, you can exclude our product and antivirus. We're fine, whatever. Don't let your vendors tell you that it's okay to exclude any product and antivirus, because they're all risks. And, you don't want to be blinded to ConnectWise remotely executing code because now an attacker is inside of it.
Yeah, we've had several stories over the last month or two about targeting RMM and remote access tools, specifically because those are, they're not LOL bins, they're not built into the system, but they are certainly going to fly under the radar more likely, especially if they're also being used legitimately internally.
Yeah, they're very efficient support tools. They're also very efficient malware distribution tools in the right hands, or the wrong hands, I suppose.
I'm excited to kick off our bottom trending, or our most rare lists. So as usual, we are going to break this down looking at threats, suspects, and risks. As we define those within Blumira, threats are, we have a high likelihood of confidence that this represents an active threat. Suspects, there's an elevated possibility that it could represent a threat. However, we don't have that high level of confidence yet. So we just give it a different priority assessment, but still recommend taking a look at those as soon as you can. And risks are potentially connected to a threat, but also could be benign activity in your environment, still worth taking a look at, because those could also present operational issues that could be a problem if exploited by a threat actor at a later time. So taking a look at our bottom ones, we've got a Sentinel-1 unmitigated POA or adware, Carbon Black blacklisted applications, multiple Google Workspace account login failures, a appearance for SOC Goalish based on DFIR report findings. By the way, if you haven't seen, we had a great write-up on some research into SOC Goalish that our own Taylor Jacobson did about a week and a half ago. You can find that on the blog. Possible data exfiltration on LastPass. That's definitely concerning. And then a ScreenConnect setup wizard authentication bypass. Justin, any notes on any of these you want to call out?
Yeah, it's a little bit choice in this case that Chris was mentioning last year's ConnectWise vulnerability, and it happens to show up in this list. This is a great reminder that even if CVEs are old, it's still good to have detections or monitor for those. So even if you're not using Blumira, make sure that you have detections. Those POCs are probably out there in the wild if you Google or on GitHub. And I would definitely recommend still monitoring for things like this, even if you know that you're patched, because you may be supporting people that maybe you aren't as clear to whether they have patched or not. LastPass and Okta would be concerning for me as well, given what they have access to. I mean, you're talking about your IDP or identity provider, and you're also talking about where you might be accessing all those identities and storing those credentials. So those two really stuck out, or rather those three really stuck out to me. C2, always bad. SOC Goalish, always bad. So I'm glad to see that this is rare and not something that we were catching a ton of things on. And the last one that really caught my eye here was the suspicious OneNote attachment execution. Also, just another great reminder, because more than likely this is coming through email. Just be aware of what you're opening. Make sure if you don't already have something that's sandboxing attachments prior to being opened, that you at least look into getting this in your environment. Microsoft 365 has some licenses that already include this. So yeah, as far as threats go, those were the ones that caught my eye.
Yeah. And speaking of wild, it's wild that, we're just now seeing a ConnectWise attempt at that vulnerability from like a year ago. So that means that somebody has installed but not set up a super old version of ScreenConnect.
Yeah, I think this is a classic example. I mean, that's a CVSS 10. Like, if you're monitoring your environment, whatever is monitoring your environment is going to be screaming about that, because that's its entire job. There's nothing that's probably scarier in your environment than that. So it is a good example of make sure all your systems are being monitored, as hard as that is to actually do. So that's one piece of it. And some of the comments you made, Justin, I thought the other parts are just like the value of like, people are going to spray passwords, or they're going to try and, essentially honeypot your environment. So it's always good to be monitoring for those things, aware of when they're coming. You always think of like a DDoS attack or something. And the other one is just like, can I hack through the front door, and how easy is it to get through the front door? So just interesting things to see pop up for us.
Another good reminder that one of the biggest factors that is going to determine your level of risk and likelihood of exploitation is economics, right? The most likely attacks that are going to be used are those that are affordable. Most affordable attacks are ones where patches are available, but they still work because they aren't going to be universally applied. So, it's certainly a tiresome but still true mantra to keep things up to date. And that is a big part of why, is simply staying up to the current version authentication, especially for security patches, is going to greatly reduce the number of attacks and exploits that will succeed. Moving on to our suspects, we've got a carbon black, potentially malicious executable file. Is that C Drive or CrowdStrike? I can't.
$C sign.
C
$. Admin share discovery. Indicator of suspected WinRM remote code execution. Unblocked crypto mining indicator for Cisco Umbrella. System failover event for Meraki. Privileged graph API role assignment for Azure. That's interesting. And PowerView recon module. Thoughts on these?
Do you ever see these and you want to find out where this happened and ask the person, like, why did you unblock a crypto mining website?
Right?
Did this get on a list wrong, or like, how did this happen?
Maybe somebody is trying to get some of that Bitcoin or Ethereum. I don't know. That one did catch my eye. But one I thought that was really interesting here is the CVE 2021 for suspected print spooler exploitation. Also a great case for having detections and monitoring in place for out-of-date or old CVEs. You never know if you're going to see this in your environment. Azure Privilege Graph API role assignment. I think this is just a great case for why you should be auditing all the things that go into Azure and enter that tie into other things like Graph API, being how ubiquitous it is. And then there was another one up here that I saw, suspected WinRM code, remote code execution. I mean, RC is always terrible. This, is one of those LOLBAS or LOLBINs. Incredibly important to keep an eye on these things.
Moving into our risks, it is interesting that almost all of these are related to Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. So we've got Linux unusual file attribute action, G Suite external document share, SharePoint 50 or more file copy events in 15 minutes, Linux chmod 777 setting. We got our first, I think, appearance of that on the Mac OS side, showing up a few weeks ago in the tops. We have a login from a Tor exit node to Microsoft 365, 500 or more file deletions in 15 minutes on SharePoint. So again, these risks, it may represent legitimate activity. However, it's also common behavioral patterns that are seen in the event of an attack. So whether these are legitimate and maybe worth a little bit of process training if it's not a behavior that you wish to see, or at least double checking to see if this is consistent with the activity that you've seen from that user before.
I think when I see this, I see these are things that you see that often trigger on, like you said, legitimate user activity, just happen to trip across the rule. But this just shows how important it is to review these every time, because 13 of the times it might have been just a user did something, and the 14th time is now malicious. So it's your vigilance is key. You've got to not drop these. Use some filtering when you can to, like, if the person does this all the time, like, find some safe ways to, like, quiet the noise. But yeah, these are cases where these could very certainly be a threat actor once in a while.
Digging into our general security news, our first one up here. Now, I want to add context because this is a unsurprisingly scary sounding headline. I'm sure that is great for clicks. OneDrive File Picker flaw gives apps full access to user drives, millions at risk. There's a research post by Oasis Security, which we'll link for you, that found a flaw in how OneDrive handles permissions. Basically, there's a lack of fine-grained OAuth scoping, and the consent screen says that only selected files are shared, but the third-party app that gets a consent permission gets broader permissions over that full OneDrive. Older versions of File Picker, that's 6 through 7.2, use an outdated auth storing method of storing tokens in insecure locations like browser local storage or in a URL fragment. I continued reading the article to find 8.0 still stores tokens in browser storage in plain text. Microsoft says they are aware, but that the, quote, system is working as designed. In terms of mitigations, it's a good reminder, check third-party app permissions, go into your Microsoft account page, privacy, and then apps and services. Take a look at those app details. For enterprise apps, you can review those permissions in Entra Admin Center. And also, as a good practice, avoid using long live tokens. Make sure those are stored securely, revoked when finished, and if at all possible, use view-only shared links, which will suffice for a lot of these things that need to access files on OneDrive. So I think that it's important to add the context that this is not files inherently at risk of exploit. This is lax permission sharing with the third-party application. However, third-party permissions and third-party login are a common source of data and sometimes identity security risk. What are some other measures that teams can take to mitigate the potential risk that these pose?
Audit. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but auditing is paramount. If you don't have a set procedure for how you're going to audit these permissions, especially as an Entra admin, please get one. There are tons of resources out there from security professionals that can guide you through the process. There are tools, for instance, like Prowler is a really good tool to use that you can use in Python, or you can go ahead and pay for a version. But there's tons of resources out there. Use them to your advantage. Additionally, make sure that you have tighter control of who can allow third-party apps. We call that like admin consent. So who can actually allow this? Can users request this? Do they have to go through a approval process? If you don't have one of those set up, also get that set up. But yeah, that's where I would at least start with something like this.
Yeah, like it's more work. Again, going back to the last thing I said, it's more work, but don't just let your users approve their own apps in Azure. Like there's so many nasty apps and so many legitimate apps that are being abused by attackers. Like this is I would say this is not surprising at all, because this is one that just happens to be a very popular, feature, but this happens. There's all sorts of funky apps out there that people get approved in there. Like, don't let your users approve their own apps. Have all apps be approved by an admin. Be picky about what apps you need. There's so much like shadow IT and like random things that the marketing team buys that you didn't know about and are risky that you catch when you don't let them approve their own apps.
Shots fired.
Yeah.
Not wrong.
It's tough, right? Like, you're a fast moving organization. You want to just find ways to do things and to push things through and make stuff happen. And then, certain types of environments, certain types of access, you can't say yes to. And so figuring out what that line is so that you can enable your partners, your company to be successful without them accidentally opening themselves up to risk. In the same way, you want good email filtering tools in place for 1,000 obvious reasons. This is just another example of like, well, it's too dangerous to start here. And so the challenge of the governance job, the challenge of the IT manager job in another case, because you have to not just do this work, but then you also have to position it to the rest of the organization that people will accept it.
Yeah. There are so many aspects of security strategy that you can look at. One of the highest level big picture views that I've helped people see in the past is it all boils down to visibility and controls. You need to know what's happening. You need to be able to do something about it. So if you notice that theme that we keep bringing up, inventory and audit, there's a step 0.5 where you need to know where to look first, right? And so that's why, if you look at really any framework, it is going to start with assessment, inventory, audit the environment. There was a Twitter thread, this was over a year ago at this point, where there was a thought exercise of, you've just been hired as the new head of security for an organization. What are you doing day one? And there's a ton of responses. It's I'm revoking everybody's permissions and making them make the argument for why they can have them back. And these big sweeping changes. And it was like, I had to scroll probably 3 pages of replies before somebody was like, I want to see how comprehensive the current inventory is and try to account for what isn't covered to see what needs attention first.
Yeah, I think that's like the first thing on like the CIS controls is like inventory. Like you can't do the other steps before you inventory.
Yep.
Yeah. And one step too that you should take is look at the documentation for these third-party apps that you are allowing into your organization. See what permissions they require and push back on the vendor. Make the vendor make the case for why these permissions are needed. And if they don't have a good reason, enact some sort of change or find a different vendor.
I've seen that so many times where they're like, well, we couldn't get it to work with very granular permissions, so we just went for the broad scope. And it's like, this is a really big red flag.
Yeah.
Do that before you buy. Do that during the vetting process.
Why does
Well,
this
it's
new
tough
agent
to-
need disable user or revoke session permission in Graph API? Well, it doesn't.
Well, I mean,
we
it's
couldn't
tough.
get to
When
work
you're building
without
the
it.
product, you have a dual mandate. Firstly, you're building for what you need right now, but then maybe you're going to want to build this thing, 6 months down the line, and maybe of course you do or do not build that thing, but you have to make that decision up front about what permissions you're going to grab. You're going to force people to re-permission, to create another token, all those pieces. And if you're not a security product, you might not think about that kind of problem quite as much. And so it's definitely a push-pull where, again, it falls down to the actual admin of the organization to be like, okay, yeah, I get they did it this way. This is bad. And like, we can't do it this way, or we need to, build some sort of controls around it or put it in some sort of unique environment. And so those things it becomes yet another conversation that has to be had, because what's the scope that they're asking for and how tightly or how well protected are you if you say yes?
Right. And before we go to our next story, the other note that I made, how commonly targeted is browser local storage when threat actors are deploying malware? In other words, how likely is it that a secret stored in plain text in browser local storage may be captured or harvested by an attacker?
Yeah, I think this is growing in popularity with the rise of the info stealer since probably about sometime last year. And someone can correct me if it's gone back further than that, but I really don't think that they gained that much traction until about last year. And I think it's part of it, I believe, is due to the rise in Mac OS, honestly, with how locked down that is. Info stealers are great because they usually don't require much more permission than what the user already has access to. And then that has just kind of triggered this cascade of, well, what can we do the same thing in Windows? Now, of course, it's up to the browser and up to the web application how these things are being stored. So, making sure that you're monitoring for this type of activity, that what kinds of browsers your users are using. Again, going back to inventory and audit, I think will go a long way into helping with this. Also, making sure that your browsers are updated. A lot of these sort of vulnerabilities and things like that that info stealers are going to leverage might be leveraging things that are related to your browser. I mean, I even saw the other day, there was some posting about a VS Code extension being used to extract secrets through a browser, because VS Code also has a browser built in as well. So there's a lot of moving parts with these types of things. I think this is something that a lot of security professionals are going to start paying more attention to if they aren't already this year. I know, at least speaking for us, we are. So yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned in the notes, but I'm working on a educational article about info stealers, and yeah, they've been around since like 2008 or 9. Zeus was, I think, the first known one, but they really, like, the popularity and frequency that they're being seen has really been surging over the last year. It's been noted in several of the trend reports that I've been looking at. So we're going to do a little breakdown on what they are, how they differ, and it segues really nicely into our next story, which was an article that NordVPN published. Some research they did around cookie misuse, reporting that almost 94 billion stolen cookies are currently for sale on cybercrime marketplaces. Now, once again, we want to contextualize and ground that information because 94 billion is a real scary number. 90% of those contain some sort of ID data. Only 0.5% of them have actual personal information like name, email, phone numbers. However, 6% of them, so about 1.2 billion of those stolen cookies, include session details. Those mostly come from info stealers. The top ones that they found on the list as sources were Redline, Vidar, Lumacy2, and Meta. Some of those attackers can purchase a base version of those packages for as little as $150 to $250. So this is probably contributing. The affordability, once again, is contributing towards why we see these become more common. In terms of mitigations here, there's some user training you can do on accepting cookies, more nuanced accepting of cookies, necessary only versus all, encouraging and doing training around logging out of active sessions, another one where a periodic restart may not be a bad idea, and making sure to keep those devices updated. So I think first, we've mentioned it a few times, but let's contextualize. I think folks are a lot more familiar with seeing password dumps or credential dumps out there. So when we're talking about session tokens versus credentials, a username password combo, how do these differ and what different risks do they pose in terms of that information being out there?
I can go ahead and jump into Chris if you want to talk first. Go ahead.
Go for it.
Okay. So we're seeing a rise in this just in general. Tokens and cookies can allow you to bypass, at least using Microsoft 365 as an example, can allow you to bypass MFA policies, conditional access policies, that sort of thing. That sounds bad just on the surface. However, depending on the type of tokens that are being used, depending on the platform that you're seeing, there are different types of tokens. Again, going back to the Microsoft 365 example, you can get like a refresh token that can keep spinning out more tokens that you can then assign different permissions to. So it can be very, very bad. I think, user training is a great way to mitigate that. There are some other tools out there that can help you in determining like risk scores and whatnot based on user behavior. It's really hard to detect this type of activity. So having detections for, info stealers, or at least monitoring for info stealer activity, is one way to go about it. User training is, I think, very difficult when it comes to accepting different types of cookies. I'm really a big fan of periodic reboots. I love that suggestion. That was one thing that we did back in my prior live. In my MSP, is we forced restarts on machines, but we also did that on a schedule and sometimes randomly. So we had to really train users to save all their stuff before doing those reboots, which did take a while, admittedly. But I think at the end it was worth it. I'll let Chris kind of add on because I know he also has some thoughts about tokens.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with what you're going to say about like user training is hard here. Like I put this kind of problem solely on like developers. We can talk about like accepting cookies or denying cookies. Responsible developers give you the option to select, and accept cookies. But responsible developers are probably also being careful about what kind of stuff you end up with in cookies to begin with. When you talk about things like addresses and phone numbers in cookies, that strikes me as somewhat irresponsible coding to begin with. That shouldn't be there in the first place. And if that developer is putting your mailing address in cookies, they probably are also not asking you to accept cookies because there's a lot of like breakdowns that happen there in coding. So I think that a lot of this is on probably browser protection and developers to make sure that they're being responsible about what they're storing on the client side.
Well, and I think the other side of it too, especially when you consider, probably positive intent in this case, just, the engineer probably isn't thinking of anything malicious. They probably haven't been trained. They don't have any security training. They don't have any security insight. They don't know what's good or bad or why. And so, they're trying to figure out the closest path from point A to B. And, that may or may not have, some potentially bad results. So I think one of the things that's interesting here too, especially in, I'll use the rise of LLM in this case, having something review your code that has some insight and some unique understanding, like, are there potential security concerns related to cookies when I'm building this thing? Like, having that knowledge, or having either someone who's an expert or something review, it's not just about bugs and the basics. It's also about, are there key security concerns that we might not be thinking about, not to mention regulatory and otherwise when you get into cookies.
And it's worth noting here, a lot of the types of malware that we talk about really frequently, like ransomware, they depend on being quiet up to a point and then being very noticeable, right? Encrypting data, preventing access. In the case of double extortion ransomware, threatening to release things that have been collected or exfiltrated. Info stealers are a little bit more of a silent but deadly kind of threat, where they can get in, get out in a matter of minutes. And if they do their job successfully, until that info that's been exfiltrated starts getting misused, you may still not know that something has happened, which is why it's so important to have tools in place to try and catch the early indicators of a potential attack, and even better, address some of those risks that can leave an opening for an attacker before it gets to that point. Talking about the packages that are available to threat actors, in addition to info stealer packages like those we just talked about, another trending one is a phishing kit from Scattered Spider. There's been a few news headlines recently. A notable one was Marks and Spencer in the UK. That are highlighting the risk that are posed by these phishing kits that are increasingly targeting help desk workers who can pose an attractive target because they have extensive access to customer information, sometimes including payment information and the ability to do a password reset or bypass. And they are trained, and their daily interactions overwhelmingly reinforce being supportive, being helpful, fulfilling requests for assistance, which is exactly the sort of impulse that attackers that are launching a phish want to exploit. There's a bunch of tactics that they may use, but one of the most common is, hey, I got a new phone and I need to update my MFA. That may be more successful if they have managed to get some initial access to a phone number through like a SIM swap attack, or through to an email account that can be used to validate. However, if you look at or ever get a chance to visit the Social Engineering Village contest at DEF CON, you can find out that with a little bit of practice and some charm, you can get a lot of information that you shouldn't necessarily, by procedures, get out of help desk teams. If they are able to gain that initial access, it's then usually pretty trivial to do a password reset, not only guaranteeing their persistence, but locking that valid user out. The help desk attacks are only one part of these identity-focused attack toolkits. They also leverage the aforementioned SIM swaps, MFA push fatigue, just constantly deluging users with push requests until they just get fed up and try and accept one. Vishing, which is just phishing over the phone. MFA bypass tools like EvilJinx that can very quickly make a flawless imitation of a login page to try and sit in the middle and harvest that session token as that user is going to log in. After getting that account access, most common next actions, harvesting and exfiltrating data, especially in cloud services where there's less consistent and often less detailed visibility or logs for tracking malicious activity, and targeting virtualized environments for deploying ransomware. In terms of mitigations here, for especially privileged accounts, consider multi-party approval. You can oftentimes do this through MFA systems and have a multi-step approval required. You can consider in-person verification if necessary for processes where there's not an ability to validate a user remotely. Also, I think we've mentioned this at least once every week, but look at these as opportunities for incident response planning. If you don't have a game plan in place for what happens if a user gets phished and has their account compromised, pick a news story, look at one of these breaches, take the details from it, and make a scenario what that would look like if it happened in your environment. Get folks together, talk through what those rules would be. It's great to do a full scale tabletop, but even a half-hour call talking through the logistics of it is better than not having anything on record at all. We're going to link to both that article as well as some additional research that Silent Push did on Scattered Spider. We mentioned SIM swap attacks a couple of times, which can precede or follow that help desk attack. What is a SIM swap attack for folks that may not be familiar? Why does that affect the MFA options that you may want to allow users to opt for?
I feel like every time in the news you see some like person with a ton of cryptocurrency get cleaned out, it's a SIM swap attack. Because you can talk about the $5 wrench attack, or you can talk about all the more subtle things like breaching their device or whatever. But no, you can just call their carrier and pretend to be the person and be like, yeah, so I got a new phone. I need to swap over my SIM, et cetera, et cetera. Cell phone providers are friendly people for the most part. They want to be helpful. They're excited that you got a new device. If you're excited about you got a new device, then they're going to probably help you. And then, oops, forgot my password, reset my password, texted link, texted code into Coinbase. It's a relatively simple process. Like, carriers are catching on to this, I think, now, and they're giving you security, enablement tools. But I think a lot of cases, those security tools are opt-in, and people don't know it's even something that could happen.
I feel like the biggest thing is just first, for your bank accounts, please don't use phone numbers as your MFA approach. If you have any other options, don't pick it.
My bank gives me no other options. It's crazy.
I know, even the big banks, they're like, oh, we want to help you, but we're not really sure how to do that quite yet. And the other thing is just be aware that phone numbers by themselves are just not secure, and so you just have to be aware that stuff happens. But I know, Justin, you wanted to jump in here too.
Yeah, no, thanks. One of the things that I would recommend, having worked for cell carriers in the past, is you can always call in and you can tell your cell phone carrier, only make changes when I'm there at the store in person. Or you can go to the store. If you're with Verizon, T-Mobile, make sure you go to a legitimate store, not an authorized retailer. And you can have them put a note on your account saying, only deal with me if you see my ID or these points of verification. And that's in addition to whatever security verification that they already offer. One thing that I wanted to call out from what Chris said, and you may not have the option for personal services, but usually with enterprise software, you usually have the option to set policies for what types of MFA are allowed. There's been a push recently. I say recently, but it's been going on for a little bit now, in using and advocating for phish-resistant MFA options, things like FIDO2 tokens, hardware tokens, things like number matching, which Microsoft thankfully has now in Microsoft Authenticator. These are all great ways to mitigate some of these things. A lot of the things here kind of resonate with me because oftentimes we talk about user education, but we don't talk enough about IT personnel education. Mm-hmm. This is one of those times where we need to be introspective and understand that, yes, we can also be the problem. And sometimes we are the worst because we know so much. So not only are table types good for kind of running through the scenarios that you mentioned already, Zoe, but I would also recommend that you use that time to see where your internal gaps are among your own team. And remember that people can always be the weak link, and we are also people.
Yeah. And that is something that goes to a culture question too, right? You need to make sure that you are fostering an environment where if people don't know, they are incentivized to ask the question so they can get the information. If they are operating from a place of fear that they're going to be in trouble if they don't know something, that's going to be an unknown unknown. I also spent time working in the cell phone field. I was going to call out you can think of it as there's a few major national providers, but once you take into account the fact that there are MVNO or like smaller regional providers that plug back into those national carriers, and there are both franchised and corporate direct stores, there is a huge number of potential targets who can have access to make changes on a cell phone account, which is why we see it be such a common attack target. And as you mentioned, Justin, make sure that you are not just checking your MFA option, but also your backup options. If you're using a FIDO token and have a backup of SMS, the level of security of your MFA is SMS, right?
Yep.
And then I think our last kind of comment here, and this ties back, I think, to the info stealer trend too. Why are attackers increasingly focused on targeting identity access rather device or data focused targets?
Yeah,
I've got thoughts, but I want to give you a chance.
It's not on the device anymore. Like, you get identity, you can SSO into things. You can spread a whole bunch of places if you breach the identity. And in many cases now, especially like Apple hardware is getting pretty locked down to the point where if you breach the device, unless you want to burn some sort of one-off vulnerability, you're not going to get anywhere anyways. So it's all about the cloud apps,
I was going to say the same. There's less of a local environment footprint, makes it a little bit harder to do that traditional find a weak point and pivot approach. So yeah, the identity more and more often is kind of that like keys to the kingdom across the board. So if you're able to breach that, like we talked about before, not only are they going to be able to get access and start getting to that data, but at the same time, they can lock the user out and delay attempts to try and eject them. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us this week. Check the description. We'll add those links mentioned, as well as a couple of tips. And I think I'll add a link for Prowler since we shouted that out as a good resource to check out. Let us know in the comments if there's something you want to see us cover in the future. Click the bell for the things and all the things that YouTube wants us to say for the algorithm. And until next time, thanks to my panelists for joining us today. Chris, thanks for hopping on.
For sure.
And until next time, stay safe out there, everybody.